There will be a statement from the governor, and then there will be questions coming from the floor. So if you want to ask something, flag me. Many of you already have. Just a reminder to turn off your phone so we don't have any nasty interruptions. Mr. Poloz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Well, good morning. Bonjour tout le monde. Carolyn and I are delighted to be here to answer your questions about today's interest rate announcement and our latest monetary policy report. So let me just begin with a few preliminary remarks. The recent drop in oil prices, of course, dominates this MPR, and it dominated our policy discussions. There is considerable uncertainty around the outlook for oil prices and the implications for the economy. My goodness. Having trouble to get this piece of paper apart. Excuse me. There we go. However, every credible scenario for oil left us with a significant issue for monetary policy. We've based our analysis on an assumption for oil prices of about $60 per barrel for the next 2 years. Although this is above current levels, prices seem likely to move back above $60 in the medium term. The drop in oil prices is unambiguously negative for the Canadian economy. Canada's income from oil exports will be reduced, and investment and employment in the energy sector are already being cut. There will be some offsets, but they are both partial and of uncertain timing. First, Canadian consumers will spend less on energy, and they could save some of the windfall rather than spending it. And second, U.S. economic growth will be stronger, which, along with a lower Canadian dollar, should boost Canadian exports. But the speed of the export response is uncertain, given the export capacity losses of the last decade. La Banque prévoit depuis un certain temps une succession naturelle de facteurs. Hausse des exportations hors énergie, hausse des investissements et hausse de l'emploi. Cette succession est nécessaire au rétablissement de l'équilibre au sein de l'économie canadienne et à la réduction des risques liés à la stabilité financière. Ces facteurs successifs se confirment et seront renforcés par, premièrement, la combinaison des prix du pétrole plus bas, deuxième, de la croissance plus vive aux États-Unis, et troisième, de niveau moins élevé du dollar canadien. However, these encouraging developments will be masked during the first half of 2015 by the impact of lower oil prices on the energy sector. Later this year, growth in Canada's non-energy economy should re-emerge as our dominant trend. But the first half slowdown represents a material setback in the bank's projected return to full employment and sustainable 2% inflation. So let me now give you some additional insight into our policy deliberations. Now, based on our assumption of oil prices at $60 a barrel, our first projection implied that it would take until late 2017 for the economy to use up its excess capacity. This would mean significant downside risk to our underlying inflation profile, which is already below target because of the expected dissipation of one-time inflation effects from meat, communications, and dollar depreciation. Now, obviously, these risks would be even more material if oil were to average $50 a barrel. Adding at least another year onto the period during which the economy would be operating below capacity and accepting more downside risk on inflation was considered unreasonable. Accordingly, we decided that it was appropriate to take out some insurance against that downside risk in the form of a lower interest rate profile. La prise d'une assurance est un élément logique de notre cadre de gestion des risques pour la politique monétaire. L'action menée aujourd'hui vise à réduire le risque que le profil de l'inflation s'oriente nettement à la baisse. Elle vise aussi à atténuer l'incidence du recul des prix du pétrole et à faciliter l'ajustement sectoriel de l'économie face aux nouvelles circonstances. La Banque dispose de la marge de manœuvre nécessaire au cas où sa projection serait trop pessimiste ou trop optimiste. We also considered carefully the matter of financial stability risks. For the past couple of years, we've seen periods of downside risk to the inflation profile, but the horizon over which we believed inflation would return sustainably to target remained reasonable at around 2 years. Financial stability risks have been elevated throughout, sometimes evolving constructively, sometimes edging higher. But they did not pose sufficient concern to make it necessary to alter policy and delay further the economy's progress toward sustainable 2% inflation. La chute des prix du pétrole, toutefois, a deux effets distincts qui concernent la politique monétaire. Comme je l'ai indiqué plus tôt, elle accroît nettement le risque à la baisse entourant l'inflation sous-jacente, mais augmente également le ratio de la dette aux revenus des ménages. And while it is true that a lower profile for interest rates may exacerbate household imbalances at the margin by encouraging more borrowing, the far more important effect will be to mitigate those imbalances by cushioning the decline in income and employment caused by lower oil prices. Ultimately, we believe that the most reliable way to reduce financial stability risks is to do what we can to get the economy back to full capacity and sustainable inflation. Finally, we discussed the risk that by moving today, we would surprise financial markets. We generally prefer that markets not be surprised by what we do, and we believe that transparency around our analysis of the economy will minimize the scope for surprises. But in that respect, we took comfort from the observation that the consequences of the drop in oil prices appear to be well understood, and that the possibility of a rate cut had begun to enter markets in the last couple of weeks. To take your questions.
We begin with Nirmala Manot of the Wall Street Journal.
Governor, two things. One is in your statement here, you said you have room to maneuver if your forecast is to pessimistic or optimistic. Your projections are predicated on oil at 60. Could you clearly say, does that mean if oil stays below 60, that you would be prepared to cut rates further?
Well, we can't be as precise as perhaps you would like at this stage. For us, this is not a business where we're being especially precise about how much we need to adjust in order to achieve what we're setting out to do. That's really why we're describing it as insurance, because we want to make sure that if there is more downside risk, that we have appropriately positioned for it. But we must remember that the world changes fast, and if it changes again, we have the ability to take out more insurance or, quite on the reverse, to reduce how much insurance we've taken out. But at this time, we simply don't have that kind of pinpoint accuracy that would allow a fulsome answer to that question.
The other question is, there are those who suggest that your move today, that surprise rate cut, is squarely aimed at targeting the Canadian dollar to boost non-energy exports. Could you respond to that?
Well, as we said in the press release and in our statement just now, this is aimed at protecting the downside on our inflation target. We've identified the risks, and those risks during 2015 are significant, that we would underperform our inflation profile that we've laid out before, and that along with that, it would take us quite a bit longer, perhaps, to close the output gap. So those things go together. So we are taking this action today in order to reduce that risk, and the market consequences will be what they are.
David Aiken, Sun News.
Governor, good morning. Last night in the State of the Union address, the President surveyed the American economy, saw growing employment, growing growth, and his quote was, in reference to that, "The shadow of a crisis has passed." I wonder if that, like a sundial, now we're in the shadow. Can you sort of maybe reflect on? Are we in some sort of shadow for the next little while that America has somehow escaped from?
Well, I think it's true that most of the hard work of recovering from the financial crisis in the United States has been done, and the U.S. economy appears to be getting onto what I would call a sustainable, self-sustaining growth track, or the term I've often used is natural. We must bear in mind that what we see in the U.S. economy is a good solid picture now, but it's still happening at zero interest rates. So in any model of the economy, you would expect a lot of growth at zero interest rates. So what you need to bear in mind is that the headwinds that are primarily global at this stage, as opposed to U.S., those headwinds still exist. So they are holding everybody back to some degree. So the shadow probably will take longer than that to truly disappear, but I am very encouraged with what's happened with the U.S. And here in Canada, we are clearly benefiting from that, and we had far less of a shadow in the first place. So for us, it's more a matter of repositioning the economy in such a way that it fires on all cylinders. So we've had quite a period where the non-energy export sector has languished because of exactly what went on in the U.S. And so we're in that phase now where what we called in the last MPR the rebuilding phase. And we'll watch it with interest. It's not something we have precisely in our models. This is rather a new experience. So we are encouraged by that in the background, and all we're saying is we see all that. It's intact. This oil price shock, in fact, has some elements to it that would actually help it occur. And in the meantime, though, we have the overshadowing of this oil price adjustment, which will make our economy look less well off just for a period of time until those other effects come in more strongly.
And just to sort of just to focus on the consumer, on the household side of things, a lot of NPRs over the last 3 or 4 years, a common theme has been concern from the bank about rising household credit, that we're borrowing too much, be it mortgages or on our credit cards. I saw a little less concern in this NPR, and I wonder if you could put a little color on the phrase that was in there, household imbalances remain elevated. What are household imbalances, and can you give us a sense of where the bank's concern is as far as my bank balance at home?
So household imbalances remain elevated. Household imbalances, the quickest measure of that is how much debt compared to income do we have, and we're at a record high for the Canadian household sector. And the evolution of that is something which matters a lot to us because it makes the economy vulnerable to a shock. It's not something which normally changes by itself, but is affected by conditions in the economy. And so, for instance, we have one now. We have an oil price shock, which will reduce the income flowing into Canada and lead probably to some increase in unemployment overall. And that's exactly the kind of trigger that we imagine in the FSR, the Financial System Review, that could make these risks more real. Carolyn, would you like to talk a bit about the housing side and how the rest of that feeds in?
Sure. I think, as the governor said, the big point here is that this decline in oil prices has been a shock to Canadian incomes, which from a debt to disposable income point of view is not good news, and certainly the interest rate move that we made today is designed to offset part of that. And we have to remember that it's more than one economy that's going on here. We've got the effect of the oil price shock in energy producing provinces, but we also have the non-exporting energy sector, and that sector, as the governor has said, has been doing pretty well. And what is really important for us to do is to facilitate that very needed adjustment. And by facilitating that adjustment, having more broadly based and firing on all cylinders, as you put it, will in fact be very supportive of financial stability and offset some of the negative effects of oil. I think the best thing that monetary policy can do in terms of financial stability at this point is to facilitate the return of output to full potential and to close the labor market gap.
Marc Godbout, Radio Canada.
Merci. En annexe du rapport, on note que vous soulignez que les effets sur les revenus sont particulièrement marqués dans les régions productrices de pétrole, mais ils se répandent dans toute l'économie canadienne par différents mécanismes. Et un des mécanismes que vous abordez est celui-ci, c'est-à-dire la politique budgétaire fédérale. Alors, ma question est la suivante. Est-ce que le gouvernement doit utiliser le prochain budget comme levier? Et si oui, quel genre d'intervention avez-vous en tête? Vous pouvez répondre dans les deux langues si ça peut vous aider.
Mais c'est très simple parce qu'on n'a pas de commentaires au sujet des questions comme ça, sauf que dans nos prévisions, on utilise les faits fiscaux qui sont déjà annoncés. On les pris comme en effet un input pour notre prévision. Ce sont les annonces déjà annoncées dans la situation. Alors, pour nous, dans notre prévision, la situation fiscale, c'est constant. Ça ne change pas.
Je reviens un peu à la question de ma collègue, c'est-à-dire que vous avez dit tout à l'heure que la Banque dispose de la marge de manœuvre nécessaire au cas où sa projection serait trop pessimiste ou trop optimiste. Est-ce qu'il faut comprendre que vous pourriez aller jusqu'à abaisser à nouveau le taux directeur si le prix du baril est inférieur à 60 $?
Mais comme j'ai dit, c'est pas une question qu'on peut répondre dans un sens très précis. Il faut attendre et suivre les effets. Pour le moment, on prend de l'assurance contre les risques vers le fond. Mais en même temps, les implications, il y a beaucoup d'incertitudes concernant les implications de ce choc pour l'économie. Et pour le moment, notre jugement, c'est qu'il faut prendre cette assurance et on va évaluer la situation encore après quelques mois. C'est la taille du choc qui est en question et aussi la réponse de l'économie et les réponses éventuelles de l'économie. C'est un processus, c'est pas quelque chose qu'il faut, c'est pas un add-up court terme. Il y a des offsets qu'il faut suivre.
Rudy Lecourt de la presse.
Bonjour. Vous dites que s'il n'y avait pas eu un geste, le geste que vous avez posé aujourd'hui, l'écart de production aurait été fermé seulement en 2017.
C'est ça.
Et que vous craigniez à ce moment-là que les attentes d'inflation diminuent. Autrement dit, qu'il y ait un désancrage des attentes inflationnistes. Est-ce que ça signifie que sans baisse du taux directeur aujourd'hui, le Canada aurait un risque de déflation comme en Europe?
Non, je dirais que non. Quand on parle de déflation, comme économiste, là, on parle d'une déflation de tous les prix en même temps. C'est pas juste la mesure d'inflation, l'IPC, qui est négatif pour quelques mois. Ça, c'est possible dans notre prévision, c'est possible, mais ça, c'est pas la déflation dans le sens d'un économiste. Okay? C'est certain que si les risques à la baisse sont plus grands, il faudra le tenir en compte. Mais quant à moi, en ce moment, pour le corps, l'inflation corps, on voit seulement une diminution légère cette année, autour de 1,7 ou 1,8%. Alors, il y a beaucoup d'espace avant la déflation.
Oui, mais c'est parce que vous baissez le taux que vous prétendez que les attentes d'inflation restent encore correctes.
Ouais.
Ma question, c'est si vous n'aviez pas abaissé le taux et que l'écart de production se serait fermé en 2017, est-ce que le Canada aurait couru le risque d'une déflation comme il en existe un risque en Europe présentement?
Et comme j'ai dit, non. Parce que la taille du choc n'est pas assez grande comme ça. OK? Mais les attentes inflationnistes sont restées très, très stables durant, même pas aujourd'hui, mais aussi durant les 5 années passées. Alors, c'est une question, le risque de déflation est loin d'ici.
Bill Curry, Globe and Mail.
Governor, good morning. My question is about which price of oil to use to plug into the forecast, because the ultimate decision on that question has a big impact, as you point out in the report, on what the forecasts spit out in the end. So in April, the bank had said they were moving away from using the futures curve, and instead you were going to use something like the spot price, assuming that they were going to stay where they are for the forecast. You're doing something different this time. We also saw Finance in the fiscal update use the spot price of 81, and they're suggesting they might do something different in the future. Private sector forecasts are also struggling with this question, what to plug in, because it makes a big difference. So can you comment on your decision to change your process in April, and then it seems like you've changed it again now, and then any kind of commentary for people who are struggling with this question as well?
Well, looking with hindsight, you can see like a year ago, we were concerned about the outlook for oil prices, and there was so much risk on both sides of the question that we did a study which examined the historical performance of such forecasts, and we concluded that it would be more honest for us to use just a fixed assumption for oil prices. It's too risky a variable to pin your whole forecast on a forecast of oil. So instead, let's put a fixed number for oil and then shock around it so people understand how your forecast and therefore your policy thinking is conditioned on the assumption, which I think it helps you understand it better than having some complicated assumption in there or a forecast. And so the fact that we were wrestling so hard with the outlook for oil a year ago is some indication of how the forces were acting. And in the end, of course, now we have the dominant force turned out to be the growth in supply. And that growth in supply is primarily from the U.S. It's from the shale oil from the U.S. So I think that we've done the right thing. And where we are now is we look at $60 as a reasonable trade-off number to do our analysis around. We are below $60 at the moment, of course. So obviously, in the short term, there's downside risk to that assumption. But I think we believe in, like many others, that eventually, with a medium-term outlook, is higher than $60. So somewhere in there is our experience, perhaps, over the next 2 years. And we analyzed 70 and we analyzed 50 very carefully. And one important note I'll make there is that the impacts of all this are not necessarily just linear. You know, like when you answer questions like, well, rule of thumb is this, but then when you do the fuller analysis, it's not exactly linear because there's a lot of other effects happening at the same time. It's a very complicated shock. I hope that answers your question.
Sure. My other question is about inflation. Today's report speaks a lot about inflation, which ultimately will have an impact on government revenues, which are tied to nominal GDP. So could you comment on that in terms of how today's analysis should affect provincial and federal revenues?
Well, government revenues are a function of what GDP does in their and what spending does in their constituencies. It's a very complicated forecasting job. We don't do that. As I said before, we take whatever fiscal plans are in place when we do our forecast, and we take them as a given. We run our forecast accordingly. So if fiscal plans adjust, that would be something else we'd have to take into account in a future forecast exercise.
Mike D'Souza, Reuters.
Governor, you spoke in your opening statement about preferring not to surprise markets. What would you say the Bank of Canada has done to prepare markets for the rate cut announced today?
Well, we have been talking about the downside risk associated with the oil price shock since last fall. I think the quote that's in the front of the MPR was from our December press conference, I guess, around the FSR. So, I mean, that was only a month or so ago, but it was starting to come into focus that the shock was bigger and that we would have to do a very detailed piece of work on it. And earlier in the previous MPR, we highlighted it as a concern because, of course, oil prices had started to drift down. But at the time, the magnitude looked as though it was still manageable within our framework, which is that, wouldn't unduly delay the return to full employment that we've been forecasting. And that's usually our approach. Like if we can manage things within that zone in which we don't, the markets will take care of things. The economy's got dynamics. We'd identified that the natural sequence of higher non-energy exports, higher employment in that sector, a little bit more investment was starting to show up. So we had the seeds planted and we could watch them unfold. Now that the shock has become big enough, well, I think everybody saw the shock. That's the good news. It's like no one's confused about has a shock happened. And usually when an economist is suspecting there's a shock happening, it's a lot harder. They're always saying, well, their model's not quite working and the economy didn't grow quite as fast as we thought. So you're trying to figure out what's going on. Well, this type of shock, you know exactly what's going on. And before you even do your forecast, you have companies making their announcements in the press about their adjustments. And we had our interviews with the boss in the sort of November, December timeframe, and we got very clear messages that there's going to be sort of a 25 or a 30% cut in spending in that sector. So we had some pretty hard numbers to work with. So all that and more actually was profiled well in Tim Lane's speech last week. So the ingredients of the analysis, though we didn't give our final conclusions, all the ingredients were out in the open. And I thought that people were pretty close to it. I thought when I read what I read out there, a lot of people were, all the economists kind of on this shock. I think they understand it pretty well.
I think when he said the impact wouldn't be drastic, was that not signaling the opposite?
Well, I would not, and I didn't use the word drastic today. I think that this is a setback. It's an interruption, if you like, in our path back to where we plan to go. It's delaying things by perhaps as long as a year, but I think we've managed to shorten that by taking out insurance against it. So in that sense, it's really not drastic. It's more of a well, we've got encouraging news, and we won't be able to see it as well for the next few months until those short-term effects happen. And the positive news that we've been watching should actually be reinforced, not just by what we've done today, but also because the U.S. economy is benefiting from the shock too, and our exports are probably going to get more zip out of it. So there, I hope perhaps I've talked you out of the word drastic. I hope so.
Les Winnington, Toronto Star.
Yes, you spoke about reduced flow of income, which I presume is related to terms of trade in all of this, and I was wondering if you could talk about how the change in terms of trade would affect, say, the average person, the average employee in Ontario in as straightforward terms as possible. I mean, how's this going to how's this going to have an impact on the average person, say, in Ontario?
Yeah, that is a very important question, and it's of course, the opposite to what we talked about for the last 10 years or so. As oil prices were rising, we talked about how those effects, the income effects, were spreading across the entire country. So, Carolyn, would you like to elaborate?
Sure. Well, I'll just start off where you left off, because when in 2002, when the terms of trade started to improve because oil prices were going up, incomes of all Canadians increased by about 7%. That's a lot if you add it up to GDP, and everybody across the country benefited from that, including people in Ontario. Although people in energy producing provinces benefited more. And so what this oil price shock does is it reverses some of those gains through terms of trade and other effects. So about a third of that's just been reversed through this decline in oil prices. And so what that means for the consumer in Ontario is that, well, everybody's going to see in the short run that they've got more money in their pocket, but they're not spending on gas and other things. Okay, and companies are going to see that their production costs have come down. And at the same time, though, this loss of income, that effect from the loss of income that we've had is going to start to dominate over time. And so overall, the consumer, we think, consumption is going to be down, probably more in other provinces than Ontario. But at the same time, businesses in Ontario are going to find that those who are exporting non-energy are going to find that they've got some offset and some uplift coming from the U.S. They're going to see some offset coming from a weaker Canadian dollar. And those kinds of effects are going to turn into jobs.
So, to put a concrete example, a fellow who was planning to replace his Ford F-150 pickup truck this year now faces uncertainty about his employment in, say, in the energy sector, doesn't buy that pickup truck. And so that's the kind of an example of how things spread around. It's the spending of the income as it comes in, it comes to various places. The spending gets all spread around, and if there's less of it, it gets spread around less. And it's a tough thing to model, but we know the arithmetic of it.
Does the flow through of less income just come through the oil price, or does it come through the change in the dollar, or what? I mean, what do we?
Well, it is. The headline of it is what we call gross domestic income, which is the total income for the country as a whole. It's less because there's less money coming from foreigners buying our oil. There's less money flowing in. Where does that actually go? Well, it goes into company profits. It goes into salaries of the people working with oil companies. It then gets spent on investments. So now say, okay, well, there's less, so the company makes less profit. Stock market, stock price affects your pension plan. Then that company spends less on investment. So a few people are laid off. We see the announcements. They don't buy the new pickup truck. And so on it goes, and the supplies, that come from all across the country. I've seen stats where a sizable portion of the inputs that are going into oil sector investment come from the east. So it's all spread across. So that may mean some layoffs in those areas, so less income to spend. And you see how it kind of like that. So it's very hard to just put that on a thumbtack and say, here's the number. We know the headline number. We know that it used to be about a 7% boost from higher oil prices, and that's every year.
Margo McDermott, CBC.
Just following up on what you're talking about, the actual impact, one of your officials in the briefing essentially said that the economy is stalled. How would you describe it?
Okay, well, stalled sounds a bit drastic. If I may, I would say this slowing is pretty significant. We were forecasting above 2% growth above potential. In other words, the gap would be closing. Now growth is going to be, we believe, significantly less than 2% for around the first half of the year. That means the gap is opening up. We're actually getting more excess capacity. In other words, we'll see that as perhaps some small upticks in the unemployment rate, for example. Or, the layoffs in the oil sector won't be offset by enough growth in other sectors for a while. But we think that the positive trend is under the surface, that the things are getting stronger. So in the second half of the year, okay, we're going to see that emerge from this much more strongly. So it's important to keep in mind that it's really like there's two economies. Like we've had for the last few years, you've got a really strong energy economy and a relatively lackluster non-energy economy, two speeds. And now what we have is the speeds will get closer together, because one's rising and the other one's falling. But the immediate part is the fall in the oil price part, and the rest is just gathering momentum. And so, so it's not stalled. But one economy is actually growing pretty well, and it's showing a lot of great promising signs. The other one is taking a break because of the low oil prices. That sounds like a stall there, but even that, there's still going to be lots of activity in the oil sector.
So there's already reaction to what you've done, and economists are already saying that the Bank of Canada doesn't cut its interest rates after not doing it for over 4 years unless something really serious is happening with the economy. So clearly you see something serious happening, whether you're saying one's going up and one's going down, but clearly you're worried. So is that a fair assumption to say?
Well, I certainly wouldn't put it that way. What I'd say is that we have a process of about a 2-year process that is getting us back to full employment, and that is the ingredient that means that our inflation target will be on 2 and be sustainably at 2. If we don't close the output gap, the inflation rate will, after those one-time effects wash out, like meat and communications and the exchange rate depreciation effects, we will be significantly below 2%, say 1.5%, somewhere in that neighborhood. And that's well below our target. So to us, that was unacceptable. And so we don't really know if oil prices are going to rebound quickly or if they're going to stay low for long, but we just know that the effect that's happened is already large enough for us to take an action to try and cushion that underneath. And if it continues like this, we know what will happen is the growth that I've identified that's faster in the non-energy economy will benefit from this extra facilitation. In other words, the reorientation of the economy to that adjustment to these new circumstances can be facilitated by making sure, absolutely sure, that the credit channels are wide open for small companies, big companies alike, that people are getting a good full-time job in a manufacturing company in Ontario, say, well, now I can afford to buy a house, so that those kinds of things happen easily, fluidly. So we're able to offer that extra little bit of assurance on the downside. I think that's worth doing. That doesn't mean that there's a really bad thing or a drastic thing happening here. It's a setback, but in a story which is actually still coming through nicely and positively.
Greg Quinn, Bloomberg.
The Bank of Canada's identity for a long time has been inflation targeting. So inflation is 2% now. Your forecast has core inflation just slipping just a fraction below 2% over the next 2 years. And in the past, inflation has gone below 1% and the bank hasn't cut rates. So what is it about today that's leading you to react with a surprise rate cut?
Well, so the Bank of Canada has never been an inflation targeter in the moment. It's always had to target inflation in the future because we know it takes us 6 to 8 quarters to actually influence the inflation rate. So what we're looking at is what would the future look like if we stood pat? And in that analysis, we believed the output gap would open more than is shown in our forecast, and it would stay open longer than is shown in our forecast. And therefore, the downside risk to the ultimate place that inflation will settle, okay, is too big for us. So inflation, like I said, you have to take out the things that are going to wash out, like meat and communications prices, those one-time effects, and the exchange rate effects. That means that what we call underlying inflation, which is where inflation would settle if nothing else was going on, is still significantly below 2%. And the risk is that it would stay there or continue to drift lower if the gap stayed open longer. So we're taking this action today to offset that risk in our analysis. And we call it insurance because, frankly, there's a lot moving around. We believe we know which side the risks are on. That's very clear. But putting an actual specific magnitude on them and knowing precisely what all these dynamics I'm mentioning will do is simply not possible. So it really is a risk management situation.
I'd like to get back to the thinking behind the decision. Many people wondered if there was a specific price point for Canada's economy where things would get really bad. Was it 50? Was it 60? How did you come to the conclusion that things were requiring more stimulus? Was it a particular price of oil, the overall investment decisions, and was it strictly things that were going on in Canada, or was it things going on in the global economy?
Well, the honest answer is it's extremely complicated, and your question suggests exactly that, because all those things kind of go into a mix. When we were first talking about the oil price shock back at late in the year, we could tell it was getting big, but there were so many effects to figure out that we needed the assistance of, well, a very, very good piece of modeling, which is what we have. Totem, you've heard us mention before, the reason Totem was developed was precisely for this reason. And it's a very significant investment the bank made a number of years ago to add the terms of trade, TOT, to the model that we used for forecasting and for doing our policy analysis, because those shocks are very complex and touch a lot of threads, which we've summarized in the box. And I don't think anybody can guess in advance how all that will work out. Okay, so I don't have a specific answer to your question. There was certainly no number that made the trigger. It's the bringing together of all those things. But when you summarize it as, oh, if the first look suggests that it'll take another whole year to get back to full employment and a stable inflation rate, that if it had been 1 quarter, then I thought, well, you know, but it was a whole year. And that's a pretty significant delay in what we've been doing. It's already been several years. And so I think in that, with the maneuverability we have, we felt it was time to use some of it.
So we're running short on time. We have time for the last person on my list, and there's one person who's indicated he'd like to do a very fast question. So we will start with Rahul Vaidyanathan from the Epoch Times.
Thanks, Governor. I just wanted to get back to something that was explained to us a little bit in the briefing, is the debt to disposable income ratio with respect to this rate cut. And it was explained that that ratio should improve or come down a little bit. And that seemed a little bit counterintuitive. I wonder if you could explain how that is expected to evolve positively with the rate cut.
Okay. Well, why don't you take that?
Sure. Thank you, Governor. So the ratio that you're talking about is the level of household debt to disposable income. And you'll see in the document that there's an estimate that without any monetary policy response to the lower oil prices, that ratio would have increased by 4 percentage points. And what that person probably was referring to was the fact that in changing interest rates, we changed both the numerator, so the amount of household debt. Interest rates work through people taking on more credit and buying more things. Natural if you get a job to go buy a house, for example. It also affects the denominator, though. It affects incomes, and that's the really important part of this. And this effect is likely to be much stronger than the interest rate effect. So if you have household debt in level terms creeping up a bit, but you also have sustainable and stronger growth in disposable income, then that ratio itself is not going to rise by as much as it would have if we had done nothing. I hope that answers your question.
And I think we're going to close with one final question from Mr. David Aiken.
Well, I just wanted to follow up on, last time I think you were in front of the House Commons Finance Committee, you spoke about the export market, non-energy export market, manufacturers. And I just bring that up because in the last couple of days, the federal government's handed out about $60 million in loans to manufacturers to add a new brewery line at a brewery in Quebec. There's a forge maker in Brantford. Yesterday they got $10 million. And I'm wondering if you see maybe some hope in the export sector that manufacturers, factories are ready to take on a little more risk. They see a slightly brighter future, given the low dollar, given the improving U.S. economy.
There's no question. We can see it in the actual export numbers that we have. Non-energy exports have gotten up. We had a couple of disappointing months most lately, but they're volatile. But the trend line has been very good this year, and it should be because we know the U.S. economy has been doing well. And the question mark for us, though, is all right, now what about all the companies that went out of business during the recession and actually started beforehand as the dollar was rising because of the higher oil price? There was, as we've discussed in the last MPR, some destruction of the capacity to export. So the question is, well, what happens next? And where our belief is that as companies get to their full employment, their full capacity level, and they see even more growth coming from the U.S., that they will begin to invest in new capacity, put in new lines, create brand new jobs. And furthermore, you've got the smaller companies that kind of come out of nowhere in that kind of environment. And that's what's almost a magical part of this point of the cycle. It's a critical stage where we actually rebuild that capacity. How quickly does it occur? Well, we haven't really been through this kind of a thing before, so we'll be watching it very carefully. But it's one of our positive ingredients, and it's another reason why having a little more downside protection in the form of a lower interest rate will ensure that the credit channels are wide open to those companies as they come up to those kind of decision points, whether they're small companies or larger companies.
And that ends our news conference. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.